Thank you everyone for joining us today for our last UPEP event in the series this term. And I would like to thank all the UPEP members for putting up a wonderful program for us this term. They've all been extremely enriching and important, and today is no exception. Today's talk is beyond COP26 towards more effective international climate architecture. And I'm pleased, as the director of the European Studies Center, to welcome a very distinguished panel today. We have, as our external speaker, Ambassador Selwin Hart, who's special advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations on climate action, and he is the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action Team. He has a long distinguished career in diplomacy. He was the ambassador to the United Nations. He was also with the American Development Bank. I think our team will put up the bios in the chat so that you can read details, but he is, to summarize, one of the leading international experts on climate change, has been involved in the process for a long time, and very few people are more qualified to reflect on what we have achieved, but also to give us an outlook what can be achieved in the future architecture of the climate change. And then we have our home team, and Professor Benito Muller is the Managing Director of the Oxford Climate Policy. He has been involved with climate change negotiations, with advisory, but he also reflects as a philosopher with a DPhil from Oxford about the ethics, the politics, the public policy implications. And he is one of Oxford's leading experts on the topic of climate change. And I know he's personally very concerned how to create global governance structures that actually help us to address these issues from a scientific, but also from a political point of view. And then as a discussant today is our very own Adrienne Chasty, who is one of the pillars of the UPEP program. She has organized this event. As you all know, Adrienne has been with the international financial institutions for a long time. She has an interest in Europe, but climate change and European responses to a green agenda, how to finance that, and how to create an international architecture, which gives us hope that we can address these issues and share financial but also political burdens across the globe, is one of her major concerns, and we're very, very happy, Adrienne, to have you as a discussant today. The running order will start with Ambassador Hart to give us some reflections on where we are, but also how the architecture multilateralism might develop. Then Benito, as always, has concrete suggestions, and then we look forward to Ambassador Hart's responses to these suggestions, and then Adrienne will comment, and then we will open it up to what I'm sure will be a stimulating debate between the audience and the panelists. So, Ambassador Hart, I think the floor is yours, and welcome to Oxford. Even though it is online, Oxford, the spirit is with you and with us. So, Ambassador Hart, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, my friend. And it's certainly a pleasure to be here with all of you and to see some familiar friends, very knowledgeable colleagues who have worked with over the course of the last few years or so. And the UN Secretary General has called this year a make or break year for climate. In less than 6 months or so, countries will gather in Glasgow for COP26. It will be the 26th time that countries have met in what is called the Conference of the Parties, which is the supreme decision-making body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And why is this a make or break COP for climate? The science is abundantly clear that we have less than a decade to meet one of the essential goals of the Paris Agreement, to hold the increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The reality is that we're way off track. But it's also a make or break here for delivering on key aspects of the Paris Agreement. On finance, a key commitment, a key aspect of trust building surround delivery of public finance to support and incentivize action in the developing world. And a key aspect of the Paris Agreement, which was missing from other agreements in the context of the United Nations Framework Convention, is on the issue of adaptation and resilience. Climate impacts are occurring across the world, in every continent, in every country, and in every region. And these impacts are getting a lot worse. And one of the good things about the Paris Agreement was that really for the very first time, it prioritized and placed on equal footing the need for international cooperation and support around adaptation and resilience. And this burden disproportionately falls on countries that have contributed least to the climate crisis, mainly the SIDS, the LDCs, and countries in Africa. And the central premise of my statement here today is that while it is imperfect, the Paris Agreement remains our best tool for confronting the climate crisis. But for the Paris Agreement, for implementation of the Paris Agreement to be successful, it requires ambitious action from national governments. Multilateral outcomes like the Paris Agreement, like any multilateral agreement, be it on human rights, be it on nuclear weapons, be it on cybersecurity or trade, it requires participants, those who have signed up to the agreement, to live by the commitments that they've inscribed internationally. And the Paris Agreement was the result of decades of multilateral negotiations on climate change. It was primarily the small island developing states way back in the 1980s who first raised the alarm on a global stage. And this resulted in the negotiations of the historic UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed at the Earth Summit in 1992. And it was out of a recognition that a major global challenge, or global challenges, and at that time, 3 really important environmental agreements were signed in 1992, that global challenges require a global solution or global solutions. And that it was essential that all voices, whether you're from a big country or from a small country. I am from Barbados, one of the smallest countries in the UN family, but that in a multilateral process like climate change, it was essential that the voices of all countries mattered. And it was through this very strong advocacy from these countries that at every stage in the evolution of the multilateral climate process, the small island developing states, they're called SIDS, and the least developed countries have set the bar for ambition. After the signing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it was recognized that this aspirational agreement needed to be strengthened with concrete commitments from major emitters. And this led to the negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol, which were finalized, I believe, in 1997. And the first draft of the Kyoto Protocol came from the small island developing states. However, after the Kyoto Protocol was signed, it did not attract the participation of the largest historical emitter at that time, the United States, and it did not incorporate emissions from the larger emitting countries. So it was clear that the effectiveness of this agreement, despite its legal structure, it was not necessarily the most effective instrument to confront the global climate crisis. And over the years, there have been various discussions on how to strengthen the multilateral system, the multilateral response to climate change in order to bring all emitters on board. And this brought us to Paris in 2015, where the Paris Agreement was agreed on. And it was the first multilateral climate agreement that attracted participation, and participation in terms of countries agreeing to cut emissions. It's the first agreement that had close to universal, or I would say universal participation. So all countries are obligated under the Paris Agreement to reduce their emissions. Before Paris, we were on a 3 to 4 degree trajectory. Following the Biden summit, the summit that was held on Earth Day, while we're not on a 1.5 degree pathway, we are seeing scientific studies and others that show that we are about 2.1 to 2.4, on a 2.1 to 2.4 degrees Celsius trajectory, way beyond the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. However, it's a significant improvement from where we were 5 years ago. The 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, which was embedded in the Paris Agreement, is 2 degrees and pursuing best efforts towards 1.5, has now become the global benchmark for ambition, not only by governments themselves, but also from key actors in the real economy. And as I said, while the Paris Agreement is not perfect, it enjoys the wide support and participation of all major governments. When the US decided to, years ago, under the Trump administration, there were some who felt that others would follow. No one else did. No other country decided to leave the Paris Agreement. So while, as I said, it is not perfect and there are ways that we will need to work to improve its implementation, it nevertheless remains the best tool that we have to address the climate process, to address the climate crisis. So today I am looking forward to hear from Benito and others on what are some of those concrete ways that we can improve the implementation of the Paris Agreement. However, I think that improvements should not sacrifice the truly multilateral and inclusive nature of the Paris Agreement. It should not result in the voices of the small island developing states and the least developed countries, for example, countries in Africa. It should not result in a diminution of their voices. Their voices, as I said before, have been key to raising the level of ambition globally on climate change. But we also need to incorporate other voices, and the process has really struggled with that over the years. The second point is that I don't believe as we seek to improve the process that we should lose sight of the political moment of an annual COP. In my view, some have said, we need to focus the COPs on technical issues. No, I believe that we still need a big bang political moment on an annual basis. When one looks at implementation, delivering on mitigation commitments or delivering on finance, delivering on adaptation, these are all political decisions that need to be made, sometimes at the level of heads of state and government. These are not decisions that can be made by a technocrat, by a civil servant. The technocrats and civil servants provide the technical basis for political decision making. Political decisions still need to be made over the course of the coming years if we're to ensure implementation and strong implementation of the Paris Agreement. So that political moment of the COP still matters. Finally, the third improvement I would definitely love to see is better incorporation of economic data. I think that has been one of the missing elements of the climate process over the years, where there has been a very strong focus on the science, sometimes to detriment of the economics on climate change. But Benito has always done a very good job of helping us in this area. So in conclusion, looking forward to hear all of your ideas. As I said, my central sort of premise is that it's not perfect, but it's the best that we have. And while we need to try to improve it, we need to ensure that those improvements do not impact on certain key and essential elements of the overall regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart, for this excellent opening statement. And of course, your sense of urgency, we have only a decade, your sense of responsibility for all nation states, that was pretty clear. Your multilateralism that says imperfect but indispensable and the best we have, which is not only for this particular issue, but probably for the United Nations as a whole. Imperfect but indispensable is one of the slogans that we hear about multilateralism. And of course, you're saying there is the need for political big bang, a political moment all the time to remind not only governments, but also societies how important this issue is. And you made a strong plea and you asked for more economic data. And you know, Benito will deliver on all of this. Benito, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hartmut, and thank you, Selwin. So good to see you again. I thought I would just say a couple of words in response to what Selwin said. And I agree. First of all, I agree. Okay. It may not look in my presentation, but you'll find out I actually agree. On a sort of meta level, I think it's important that we understand that the multilateral regime, now the Paris Agreement regime, cannot guarantee and deliver ambition. It's nationally driven. But what the regime can make sure is that it facilitates ambition, and or better still, that it doesn't hinder ambition, because that the actual process can be in a way that it actually is not optimal to further ambition, right? Cannot guarantee it, and we should not expect it to guarantee the ambition, but we can expect it to be built to facilitate as much ambition as we can squeeze out of the system. In this context, as Selwin alluded to, justice in all its form is very important, which is why we need to keep the multilateral regime going. We could solve the problem, the mitigation problem, the emission problems with the G20, I think, whatever, right? But if we do that, adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, key issues for particularly the most vulnerable, would just be left by the wayside. We need to keep them together, and the only way we can actually ensure that they are being given a sufficient emphasis is under the multilateral climate regime, the Convention and the Paris Agreement. It's also important to ensure procedural justice, and that's what Selwin actually directly alluded to. We must ensure that small countries, you know, not the big important ones, but important for themselves and as a group, have the right to are being heard, right, in a fair manner. And that's procedural justice. And that's one of the things which I've been dealing with, you know, as a philosopher for some time. And the presentation which I'm going to give you now is also the background is precisely that. How can we make this happening without losing the political big bang every year at all? I mean, that's not what I'm going to be proposing, but how can we make the process work in a better way, more efficiently? So I will now try to share my screen. Okay, and I will do. So is this okay? Can we all see it?
We can.
Good. Thank you very much. So In March, we published a report about future arrangements for intergovernmental meetings under the UNFCCC, which includes the Paris Agreement, which we called, where we introduced a new option, which is called settled and fit for purpose. And the report had a foreword by Marianne Carlsen, chair of the SBI. Here's a little bit of propaganda, PR from. I've never had a report of mine actually come into a FT article, okay? But this one did. They called me up, they said what a great report, and they wanted to know what, so I can recommend the article if you don't want to read the report. Here is Marianne said, basically any healthy organizational process has to at some point consider the efficiency and relevance of how they organize their work. How is the process set up to deliver on the many mandates and tasks given throughout the more of 25 years of operation of the climate regime? And does the beginning of the implementation year of the Paris Agreement call for process changes? That was her sort of theme in the foreword. I mean, one thing which we need to think about or keep in mind is, well, let me just, I'll come back to that. Well, no. One thing which we have to keep in mind is that so far we have had some implementation. We had some implementation of the Kyoto Protocol, and then we started renegotiating a treaty. And the focus of the multilateral regime for the last 20 odd years has in essence been treaty negotiations. So hopefully we're not going to start negotiating another treaty next year. It wouldn't surprise me if it happens, but no, please not, okay? We now have a treaty. It's not perfect, as Selwin said. It's good enough. Let's work with it. And so the question is, how do we actually make the whole process come away from treaty mode into implementation mode, if it needs to change? Now, we have had these discussions under an agenda item called Arrangements for Intergovernmental Meetings for many years. At the time, just before Paris, Yves de Boer wrote or had a note written, which sort of summarized what parties had submitted. And just to tell you what we're doing is, we looked at these options and just looked, can they actually be delivered? And if so, how? And we came up with a new combination and then looked at that combination. In terms of frequency and organization of sessions, there was the option of annual COPs, alternating between larger, more politically oriented sessions and smaller implementation focused sessions. The idea behind that was that the smaller COP and CMP sessions would the idea was that we can get there by taking some elements away from the COPs. In terms of the venues, there was an option put forward about alternating annually, but alternating between the presidency country and Germany. You have to remember that Bonn is actually the default location for the COP. And it was felt that the Bonn sessions would increase the opportunity for more parties to serve as the presidency, particularly parties that are not in a position to host a conference otherwise. Why is that a problem? Well, first of all, it's the size of things. That is the graph which the FT sort of used. It is amazing that each of the treaty COPs, as I call them, because Copenhagen basically was meant to be one, it wasn't in the end, doubled the number of attendants afterwards. And it has, and we did some very, a good colleague of mine, friend of mine, did some sort of regressions. He's an economist and stuff. It has nothing to do with agenda items, how many they are and things. It is just the sort of the more and more stuff started to happen at the COP sessions with very little to do with what the COP actually does, you know, the actual sessions. So our aim, or our settled and fit for purpose option, would be in Bonn annually, and in terms of whether this is possible. Remember that the Fiji COP, small country, was actually in Bonn. It was a big COP, 20,000 participants. It cost Germany 125 million to do that. And I know the Germans wouldn't do that for every single year. It's just not on the cards. So how can we get the size down to where this is actually possible in Bonn? And it's 5,000 people is about what the Secretariat estimates can go to Bonn. We had that just after Kyoto. And how can it be achieved? Again, we go back to the options which have already been discussed in the process. You can remove certain meetings of subsidiary bodies, ministerial participations, and deal with the side events. Now, in practice, in Bonn, COP23, we had two zones. We had the Bula zone, which is now the blue zone, the UN zone, where all the decisions, I mean, where the actual negotiations happened. It still has side events and stuff, but this is one zone. And then they introduced the green zone, or the Bonn zone, as it was called there, where they had the sort of the global climate action events. We had the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. There were over 100 events, and they had speakers ranging from Arnold Schwarzenegger to, well, Jerry Brown. I mean, celebrity, big, I mean, sort of big news item stuff, right? The two were physically distanced by about 2 kilometers. And this was, as I said, this was the first time that we had these two zones. There were different accreditation, different participation regimes. The green zone, the Bonn zone, was actually managed by the host country Germany with Fiji, and the blue zone is usually by the UNFCCC Secretariat. So what we're proposing is to use the same sort of separation of the global climate action stuff and have them annually performed at global climate action weeks. High level segments, you know, I mean, the ministers don't actually physically have to go to the COP plenary, which is usually empty, and give their speech there. Okay, that's not necessary. They can even go virtually to that Climate Action Week. The Global Climate Action Week was actually envisaged not by that name in the Marrakesh Partnership, but it sort of got lost in translation. They wanted to have an event, a global event, before the COP, and it then came into the green zone at COP 2020. What was it? 3 in Bonn. We would do that annually before the COP and coordinated with the regional climate weeks. So Selwin, we're not pushing for the abolition of the big bang political moment, not at all. But in our view, it would make sense to actually we can separate, and we can still have an annual stock taking of political ambition and things. And where would that be? Well, in our view, the easiest is, you know, we do the distance and we go to Geneva because it's a UN headquarters, and it has to. If we have a summit level week, they have the infrastructure to deal with that, right? And I think the Swiss will probably not be unhappy to have an event like that in Geneva. So let me just see, we can have variations of this theme. For example, every 5 years, when we have a global stock take, we could have the small COP move to Geneva during that action week. No problem at all. Or we could have summits and things. So look, even the fact that we are proposing it should be settled in Bonn, it could still even move around. I mean, being small makes it much easier to move around too. Okay. So all these sort of the sort of combinations are possible. What we try to do is to take the elements which have been proposed by parties, pick out some of them which we felt are particularly intriguing, and look how could we make them work. Because, you know, people, as I said, have proposed small COPs, but how do we get there? And the way we showed statistically it should be possible is by disentangling all the stuff which was added on at some point organically, and take this away somewhere else. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benito. And you promised not to call for the revolution, but for reasonable adjustments to what we have seen. And I think now I give the floor to Adrienne to respond to both presentations, and then I go back to Ambassador Hart to maybe reflect on Benito Muller's suggestions. Adrienne.
So thank you very much. I really appreciate this wonderful seminar, which is the culmination of the program on climate that UPEP has been running this year. And so let me react both to what Benito said in particular, and then to Selwin's statement that it's good enough. And we have to make do with what we've got, because I think we should be talking about how we actually push more ambitiously to achieve the climate targets. I think if we don't push more, we risk not meeting the targets. And I'm talking both in terms of global warming, in terms of raising finance. So I think we can't just stick with what we've got more to do. Let me share my screen and make a couple of points. Okay. Okay, so Benito's main point is the unwieldiness of the current COP arrangement. And I must say I completely agree with him. I went to the Bonn COP, and I was a bit taken aback by how complicated it was, and how much was going on, and how, in a way, badly it reflected on climate goals, because the carbon footprint was so heavy. So I completely agree with him that it would be a good idea to downsize the COP, to separate the negotiations and other activities. But I also strongly agree with Selwin that we mustn't underestimate the value of high-level engagement, not only in the photo opportunities, but also in keeping not only heads of state, but ministers involved in decision-making for the implementation. If you don't have ministers being set deadlines and milestones and speech-making opportunities, their understanding of and their commitment to the process will be eroded. So I think what Selwin said is very important about maintaining the high-level engagement. Although for me, I can perfectly well see it being in Benito's proposed framework, that it's in the Climate Action Week as opposed to in the COP. The other point I would make on the separation of the Climate Action Week from the COP, from the negotiations, is that the energy of the non-state actors is very, very important. And you could see that at Bonn, a lot of the action was in the non-state sector. And I think some of that was motivated by the fact, this feeling that Bonn was very important. Angela Merkel spoke, Arnold Schwarzenegger, as you said. It would be, if you separate the non-state from the negotiations, it'll be very important to have a strategy to maintain the energy and the focus of the Marrakesh and related non-state processes. Now, Benito's point about unwieldiness mainly related to the cost and the complexity. I guess I want to make a more provocative point that pushes back on Selwin a bit. I understand the importance of universalism to the Paris Accord, but I want to at least raise the question of whether we need to start considering the creation of smaller groups. I'm thinking in particular of dealing with carbon pricing. We seem to be very stuck on carbon pricing. My group had a seminar a couple of weeks ago on the European Union and what it plans to do on the carbon border tax adjustment, which is quite defensive and awkward and difficult. And the IMF is proposing an alternative to that, which is an agreed coordinated carbon price floor, but that would only be possible among a small group of the biggest emitters. I mean, think the G20 or some subgroup of the G20. So while I respect and understand the value that we've gained from universalism and how important it is to be global on this, I think we have to start talking about small groups for at least some of the areas where we need to make progress. Now, since I'm being provocative on making progress, let me raise some other issues about encouraging implementation and ambition. I mean, both Selwin and Benito have said it's not perfect what we've got, but it's good enough. Now, I look at the way oversight of climate action is carried out, and I compare it with my background in the IMF, which had oversight of countries' macroeconomic strategies. And I'm going to suggest that one imperfect but more effective, possibly more effective way forward would be to strengthen the oversight process, going in the direction of the kind of model that the IMF has. I don't know if you can see on my screen. So in the IMF, the structure is more defined and it's more frequent. All countries must report to the IMF board, meaning report to the international community annually about their macroeconomic strategies. And then they must listen to the feedback from their partner country peers who are reacting to their plans. And all of these reports are in a uniform framework. And the report is accompanied by an objective technical assessment by IMF staff. So what this does is it provides a much clearer shared understanding of what countries do and where they're falling short. And it makes each of them individually much more accountable for their actions than they would be if they didn't have this formal reporting arrangement. And the combination of more frequent reporting, better understanding of the implications, more explicit accountability, and the peer pressure from the reacting countries provides some level of stick that oversight of macroeconomics has, that oversight of climate action doesn't yet have. And so my concrete suggestion is that we bring in some kind of process for critical scrutiny of NDCs that's much more formal and structured and frequent, frankly, than is envisaged. In Benito's report, I think he was concluding that the NDC assessment will remain informal and didn't seem to give it much weight in in contributing to encouraging implementation and ambition. But I don't see what alternative options we have other than strengthened oversight and peer pressure. So that's one of my 2 points. And then I have one final point with two sub-points. Selwin mentioned the second important agenda item, which is particularly important for COP26 and also for maintaining universalism, because it brings the smaller countries along and enables them to implement their climate action. In my view, again, with my IMF background as a prism for this, climate financing has kind of lost its way. It's got very slowly bogged down in many minutiae, in micro requirements that make qualification difficult and slow countries' ability to access financing. I'm comparing the current system of climate financing with the way the IMF and the World Bank delivered money to the international community when they were tasked with doing so for debt relief and poverty reduction. And what they did was they told countries to develop their own programs, not projects, but compilations of projects or strategic portfolios of projects. They assessed the quality, the overall quality of this program, and then they gave fungible money for the program rather than for every project separately. It would be very easy to do this for programs based on NDCs rather than being kind of anchored to the much more difficult project financing. In that case, the money would come on a much larger scale than as it does now through very many small scale projects. It would leave countries with more control and more room to maneuver, and also more responsibility that would go along with this. And it would reduce the holdups and red tape associated with the various box ticking exercise that all the agents and interest groups apply in order to clear the projects. So my first point is more program financing, less project financing. And my final point, again, picking up on an interesting seminar we had a couple of weeks ago, I really believe that now is the time we can make more progress with financing. There is low-hanging fruit out there in the sense that the IMF has just committed to issuing a new SDR allocation. Most of that will go to rich countries because it's based on countries' economic size, but the rich countries don't need it. And in my view, it would be much easier to persuade the rich countries to donate their new SDRs to developing countries that need climate finance and vaccines, but we're talking about climate finance, than it would be to continue the current pressure on countries to donate financing from their domestic budgets. So even though none of this is very easy, I think that before COP26, we should be encouraging the politicians to make an effort to lobby for rich countries to donate their SDRs to top up the 100 billion in the climate financing for developing countries. That's my final point. Thank you very much. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Adrienne. And I refer back to Selwin because we have heard a few proposals how to improve the operation of the multilateral regime that we had. And we have proposals how to strengthen oversight and international involvement. For me, global governance is always the level of the multilateral, the level of the nation state, and the level of consumers and producers at societal level. And how to bring these levels together in order to achieve the goals, for me, is the big question in climate change. And having observed this for quite some time, it is fair to say that we have increased awareness, but we haven't reduced the emissions globally. So that is the challenge. And whether 25,000 people or 5,000 people travel, whether it's big bang or small groups or bigger groups, this is all part of an international governance. But when it comes to compliance and implementation, I think we need to be much more creative. And I hope that we will have the chance to discuss how to translate the multilateralism into concrete action at the national and the local and the personal level. But maybe Selwin first to respond to what was presented here and see whether he has room for these adjustments, whether he thinks, well, thank you, but not enough or too much. Let's hear what Selwin has to say about Benito's and Adrienne's concrete suggestions how to reform the multilateral framework that governs the climate change issue. Selwin.
Thanks. And apologies, but I was kicked out of the call at the tail end of Adrienne's presentation. Really great presentation and extremely provocative. And let me start with my thoughts about the Paris Agreement. So my view, it's the best instrument that we have. It's not perfect. It does not mean that I think that we should just leave it and focus now is on implementation. The focus now is on ensuring that the various provisions and parts of the Paris Agreement deliver on the top line aspirations of governments. So governments are currently working on building out the transparency provisions of the Paris Agreement. Now, going into Paris, this was one of the big issues. Now, how do you measure and report and verify a commitment that a government wishes to take, right? Prior to Paris, there were two systems, one for developing countries, one for developed countries. What Paris did was to have ensure that there was one system with built-in flexibilities for least developed countries and the small island developing states without undermining the basic premise for a strong system to measure, report, and verify. And why is the transparency system of the Paris Agreement so important, or the transparency system of an international agreement of this nature is so important? And Adrienne, I saw your point about and your suggestion on the International Monetary Fund. I don't think countries will go that far. I think the emphasis should be to ensure that the MRV system, which was agreed on and which must now be put in place in the UNFCCC framework, delivers on really its core raison d'etre. Countries need to know that when a country makes a commitment, is actually following up and doing what it committed to do. And I believe that this helps to incentivize higher levels of ambition. Because if the United States knows that China made a commitment and China is following up on its commitment, it's doing what it's supposed to do, given and following the rules of the regime, I believe that helps to start this virtuous circle of raising ambition. And really that was what it was intended by the Paris Agreement, right? So you also made the point about smaller groups and whether we should abandon the principle of universalism on specific issues, and you made reference to carbon pricing. The reality is that we're already, smaller groups are already addressing some of these difficult issues. So a country or a region submits a nationally determined contribution, but that country is free to address or is free to choose from the menu of options, menu of policy options, whether it's carbon pricing, whether it's phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. So countries are free to choose whatever policy measure they deem fit to implement their nationally determined contribution or their national climate target. So countries are already working in smaller groups outside of the UN FCCC framework. I don't want it to seem as though the UN is the only place, the only framework where you work on climate. No, countries are working on climate at home. Countries are working on climate in other multilateral organizations. Countries are working on climate in regional, in various configurations. The beauty of the Paris Agreement is that it's this one place where all countries are, where you put a target, you say in your communication, I intend to achieve my target by reducing emissions in the energy sector, in transport, etc. I intend to use the following tools, placing a price on carbon, etc., etc. And then there's this framework to measure, report, and verify that you're doing what you're saying. There are no penalties, etc. So it facilitates raising of ambition. So countries are already working in smaller groups. What I would caution against is on issues fundamental to the regime itself, that lie within the regime itself. All voices are needed. So while I hear you on changing the nature of the COPs, and we can tweak and go to climate weeks, etc., we really cannot lose that fundamental tenet of multilateralism. One country, one vote. How it works in practice is that while there might be 200 parties or 200 countries participating in the UN Framework Convention meeting, and Benito would tell you this, and other colleagues, in the end, they organize themselves in a way that ensures it is not an unwieldy process. So while you have two countries, you have the developing countries with a spokesperson, you have the African group within developing country organizing itself around common positions. You have the least developed countries organizing themselves around common positions, and you have the 40 island states organizing themselves. So there is some order to what might seem like a disorderly process, and countries have a way of self-organizing based on their respective interests to ensure that a negotiating process can be run as smoothly as possible. Finally, I think that we need to distinguish between negotiated outcomes and political outcomes. So negotiated outcome, the Paris Agreement was a negotiated outcome, right? Countries worked on text and on the various agenda items in the UNFCCC, countries work on text like the Article 6 and try to have negotiations. I believe that over time we'll see less of that, right? Because we already have the Paris Agreement framework. There's no need, in my view, to negotiate another treaty. We need to focus on the implementation. So I believe we will have less of those sort of intense negotiations. But then we have the political outcomes. So political outcomes around a country choosing what number to place in a nationally determined contribution, right? Should I reduce my emissions by 20% or by 25%? That's a political outcome. That's not based on a negotiator from Barbados telling a negotiator from the UK what needs to be in their nationally determined contribution. A political decision or choice is made by the Environment Minister of the UK. It goes to cabinet, etc. So those are political, similarly on finance and on public finance, those are political outcomes that then need to find their way into some way into the negotiating framework. But so the UN does not necessarily have control over what individual governments need to do. Question is, how can we use the political moment of a COP to ensure that what the UK, not picking on the UK, but the political outcomes that the UK has to make is in sync with those of the EU, is in sync with those of the US, China, etc., so that there's scrutiny and spotlight placed on the political choices that countries make. Because on the NDCs, on 1.5, we need countries to be as ambitious as possible. And those decisions are not taken, as I said earlier, by technocrats. They're taken by politicians. They're taken by prime ministers. They're taken by ministers. Thank you.
Thank you. And I mean, maybe I would like to ask Adrienne to come back to defend her oversight system, right? Because Selwin said countries wouldn't do it. But why wouldn't they do it, right? If there are no sanctions attached to it, it's why not having a global platform where every country every year says this is what we have done. And these are our choices. And this was our target. And why wouldn't they do it? If there's a sanction regime attached to it, then we go into a very different type of regime. But if it's a reporting, monitoring, awareness raising, showing pride in what one has achieved, why wouldn't they buy into it? Maybe Adrienne, do you want to defend your system a bit more and saying, yes, oversight, and there should be global monitoring and countries should agree to that? Adrienne.
Thank you very much for being positive about it, because I wasn't surprised at Selwyn's reaction. Unfortunately, when you say IMF type oversight, it puts people off. And you described it in as neutral as possible a way of just more oversight than there is now, with more discussion, feedback, and in some sense, the creation of mutual accountability, which would be helped by a more frequent discussion, a more uniform presentation of what countries are doing. And as Selwin said, more transparency, which is going on. I mean, everyone's working to get a clearer oversight system. But my sense was that both he and Benito don't think it's going to get us very far. Whereas I think it's one of the few weapons that might make a difference between not achieving higher ambition and nudging reluctant countries into higher ambition. And we would do that by never mentioning IMF type oversight, but by mentioning more frequent, more structured, more accountable oversight in the good way that you just said now. Thank you. Benito has his hand up.
Benito.
Can't resist. Okay. I think one thing which we must avoid, and there's a tendency with some in the negotiations, is trying to make rules to prevent participation in bad faith. It's not going to work. What we need to do is to make rules so that participation in good faith can be maximized and delivers, right? Quite a different approach. So even the word oversight is, I think, not the right sort of word to use. We do have a transparency system. We have a 5-yearly global stock take. So the tools of transparency and stock taking and reviewing are there, okay? And in that context, parties are meant, I mean, they're meant to actually give and tell the international system what they're doing, how far they got with their NDCs. So this stuff is in there, but not as a matter of oversight and punitive measures and all that. That is not going to happen. But the transparency, the information, the quality of information, all that sort of stuff is very important. I would agree, but it's how we translate it is very sensitive. Thank you.
Selwin, do you have a similar answer along those lines, or do you have more room for
No, 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 no. I honestly believe that the IMF can play a role using the existing tools that it has. The Article 4 consultative process can be used to address climate can be incorporated into that overarching system. But for it to be, it's really going to be difficult for countries, given what we know and what the countries have said in the past and negotiations leading up to the Paris, for us to bring this into the system. But that being said, the IMF is already looking at climate risk in its Article 4 consultative process. It's been deployed, I know, for example, in a few of the Caribbean countries, but it's going to be difficult for it to be, I would say, near impossible for us, for countries to agree to use the fund as a tool for or a replacement to the existing MRV system.
Thank you. Adrian, you want to come back?
Yeah, just very briefly. Certainly that's not what I meant. In fact, when I was in the IMF, I actually explored whether the IMF would be willing to go in that direction, and no one was willing. You know, oversight of macroeconomics is enough, rather than covering climate as well. My point is a different one, that the NDCs lend themselves very easily to a more structured presentation and discussion and kind of comparison across countries. And so you could imagine not an IMF, but the same type of process for looking at NDCs and saying to country X, but you promised this, have you done it this year? Tell us what you've done. And then have peer countries come back. And I don't see the assessment of NDCs going enough in that direction, even though I think it would be very helpful, and it kind of needs to be done. That's all I meant. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. And I think it's time to open up the floor to our audience. And we have a few questions in the Q&A